On behalf of the Macquarie University Rank and File Committee, the Western Sydney University Rank and File Committee, the Committee for Public Education and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, we welcome you to this meeting. Oppose Labor's national priorities, university restructuring and job cuts. My name is Carolyn Kennett and I'm a staff member at Macquarie University, a member of the Committee for Public Education, the CFPE, and a founding member of the Macquarie University Rank and File Committee. And I will be chairing this meeting today. We have called this urgent public meeting to clarify what is at stake in the assault on university education and its transformation to meet the needs of the corporate elite and the war machine. In the meeting, we will outline in detail all aspects of the assault, the job destruction, the impact on students and their future, and the systematic assault on democratic rights and academic freedom. Our meeting will also importantly outline how to oppose this agenda, what perspective must be fought for to defeat the assault, including the moves towards dictatorial rule most sharply expressed in the United States. In our statement calling for the meeting, we made clear from the first sentence that what is happening here under the Albanese government is in sync with the agenda of the Trump administration. The Labor government is pursuing the same pro-corporate and militarist agenda as the Trump administration. This is seen in the recent meeting of Albanese and Trump. The recommitment to AUKUS and the rare earth minerals deal both represent the accelerating plans for Australia to become integral in the US war plans. Internationally, public education is being eviscerated for corporate profit, subordinated to the narrow requirements of employers and restructured to prepare for war. In the US, universities, colleges and schools nationally face cuts in the federal budget and political attacks from the Trump administration, including withholding hundreds of millions of dollars of federal grants and funding. In the UK, the Labor government is eliminating 10,000 university jobs. Here in Australia, Labor's pro-corporate and pro-war restructuring of universities is taking place at the cost of thousands of jobs, accompanied by the reactionary witch hunting and cutting enrolments of international students and the elimination of course options for students. Globally, the unions are completely complicit in the attack on education. In the United States, the union apparatus have systematically blocked the mobilisation of educators, students and workers against the dismantling of public education. At Australian universities, the National Tertiary Education Union and the Community Public Sector Union, aided and abetted by the pseudo-left organisations, are doing everything in their power to suppress the opposition of workers to the gutting of public education, covering over for the war agenda of the Labor Party. Last week, we saw millions of people turn out across the United States and globally in the No Kings marches. Demonstrators denounced Donald Trump's authoritarian drive and bipartisan assault on democratic rights, demanding an end to the dictatorship, police repression and state persecution of immigrants and workers. For 2 years, hundreds of thousands of workers have turned out to Gaza protests in opposition to the war agenda of imperialism and the genocide. And we are witnessing an international upsurge of working class struggles. In France, hundreds of thousands have protested against sweeping social cuts. And in Italy, millions have joined strikes in opposition to the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza and the Maloney government's fascistic policies. In New Zealand, just last week, more than 110,000 public sector workers, about 3.5% of the population of New Zealand, took strike action, the biggest strike in New Zealand since 1979. Workers, including educators internationally, have shown willingness to fight. But what next? The fight against dictatorship and war, the fight against attacks on education and democratic rights requires the independent mobilisation of the working class under a socialist program. That is why we are calling for the formation of rank and file committees in every workplace, school and neighbourhood as the new organisations of struggle against war, genocide, dictatorship, fascism and social counter-revolution. That is the political perspective that our speakers will outline today. We have three speakers joining us today. David Rye, who is joining our meeting online from the United States. David is a member of the National Committee of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality in the US and a teacher in California. He's also a member of the committee, Rank and File Educators Committee in the US. Zach Diotte will be our second speaker. He is a member of the IYSSE here in Australia and president of the IYSSE Club at Western Sydney University. Mike Head, a member of the Socialist Equality Party's National Committee, a founding member of the Western Sydney University Rank and File Committee, who writes on the World Socialist website both on education and matters relating to the Australian government, will be our third speaker. We will then open up for questions and discussion. I would like to give a warm welcome to our first speaker, David, and thank you for joining us online.
I am speaking both in my capacity as a representative of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality and as an educator with the Educators Rank and File Committee in the United States. I will start with the broad attacks against public education in the United States, headed by President Trump, outline the expressions of social opposition that this has engendered, and the connection between the experiences of educators and students in the United States with those of educators and students in Australia. And I'm sure that all listening will find the parallels striking. And I will also say that more meetings like these will be necessary to draw together the struggles of educators and students in Australia, the United States, and indeed worldwide. First, there is the character of Trump's presidency itself, which is carrying out open preparations for the establishment of a dictatorship and expressing the fear of the American financial aristocracy, of the working class, and of the fundamental crisis of American capitalism on the international stage. Trump and his government have made a particular target of universities, educators, and students. Among the first targets of his administration from the beginning of his presidency have been students of international backgrounds and universities at which there were campus protests, starting, of course, this repression started under the previous Biden administration. Trump has sought to liquidate the Department of Education, which is not merely a policy making body, but the outlet for the distribution of meager yet essential social services in schools. Funding for schools in the United States has been inadequate far before Trump became president, leaving it desperate and fragile in the face of the hammer blows from the current government. To give only one example, the major school district in the city where I am speaking from is over 800 million, almost $1 billion behind on basic maintenance and repairs to the facilities. The staffing ratios are unsustainable, particularly in education settings, classrooms where students have special needs, where more one-to-one attention from instructors is required. I spoke recently to one teacher who, per their contract, was supposed to have 55 high needs students under their care, and they had over 80. Early this year, Trump halted the federal funding to major universities, as was alluded to in the introduction, which was holding up their capacity to carry out research. Trump has also sought to block universities such as Harvard from enrolling any international students. There was a frame-up of two scientists of Chinese nationality on smuggling charges for importing harmless groundworms and an exceedingly common plant parasite without proper paperwork. The researchers were absurdly accused of being a part of a Chinese plot to sabotage American agriculture. The academic careers of these researchers has been effectively ended. The IYSSC in Michigan was the only organization to speak out, and of course our collaborators throughout the United States, but spearheaded by the comrades in Michigan, the only organization to speak out against this politically motivated prosecution, which grew out of the US war machine's drive for a war against China. Earlier this month, Professor Thomas Alter, a historian of labor and social struggle at Texas State University, was fired for his participation in a socialist conference. He was denied his rights as both a member of the faculty with tenure, as well as his rights to political speech and association outside of the workplace. And he was not even given a fair opportunity to present a case in his defense. The IYSSC and our education comrades have taken up a defense campaign on his behalf. Most recently, Trump has dangled the very funding he cut from these universities in front of the universities in the form of a so-called compact, which promises the return of the withheld funds in exchange for the total submission of the universities to the ideological control of the representatives of the Trump government. Students have largely spoken out against the compact, and several universities have felt compelled to reject it. We have warned that no confidence can be placed in the university administrations to act as a bulwark against Trump. Since the start of the assault against the universities, the World Socialist website has characterized Trump's assault on education as the American version of the Nazi policy Gleichschaltung, or the bringing into synchronization of the academic and ideological life of institutions of education with the propaganda and research needs of the regime. The assault on education is but one of the vast multitude of the sources of anger within the population against the Trump government. The assaults on education, including higher ed, public health, and the sciences, and in addition, the attacks on the working class directly through the ICE immigration raids, terrorizing of neighborhoods, and the consequences of the accelerating economic slowdown, the rising cost of living, have all combined to give rise to the largest protests in United States history. October 18th's second round of No Kings protests drew out an estimated 7 million participants, which is 2 million higher than the first round of protests this past June of 5 million, and more than double the size of the protests earlier in April. Trump is not only not a popular president, he is nearly universally despised. His approval rating and strong disapproval ratings together pull upwards of 60% of the country, while his approval rating sits below 40%. The protests are an expression in only the initial form of the growing movement against rising authoritarianism, social inequality, and war preparations. Both rounds of No Kings protests broke records for largest protests by attendance in US history. In case there was any doubt, the world must recognize that there are two Americas, that of the oligarchy, in whose interests Trump speaks, and the working class, which still carries within it a deeply felt affinity for the struggle for democratic rights, the American Revolution, and Civil War. There are other expressions of opposition growing in the population. Just over a month ago, the murder of the fascist Charlie Kirk being seized on as a pretext to accelerate Trump's plot for dictatorship, the official narrative has collapsed. The manufactured outrage over alleged insensitive comments and the attempts to elevate him to the level of a civil rights martyr or an intellectual leader, this nonsense has been decisively rejected by the vast majority of the population. In the last week, really only a couple days ago, students at high schools in suburban Detroit have walked out in opposition to the establishment of Turning Point USA chapters at their schools. Turning Point is the billionaire-backed far-right propaganda operation which Kirk founded and led. It is not a popular mass organization, and the establishment of these clubs in Detroit schools is largely a top-down operation, opposed by broad layers of students and faculty. In the initial weeks following the murder of Charlie Kirk, criticism of Kirk's politics, including merely repeating his own words to belie his canonization, was grounds for firings and expulsions of educators, workers in other industries, and students. The impact of this campaign was, for masses of people, a shock, as those who had never heard of Kirk were hearing his words and political positions for the first times. They would say to themselves and each other, if this fascistic, racist garbage is what he had to say, then his being celebrated means that the government supports fascists. Over 100 students at Royal Oak High School in Detroit walked out in protest of the establishment of a club at their campus. Students at Romeo High School in Detroit have taken to social media to voice opposition to the establishment of clubs at their campus, while the school boards and administrators and policies protect the establishment of TPUSA chapters at public high schools. We have called on teachers who oppose the fascist politics to join the educators' rank and file committee, and students who opposed the establishment of these clubs to build the IYSSE on their campuses. There needs to be a conscious connection of the struggle of educators in the United States with the struggles of the Committee for Public Education here in Australia. It would be incorrect, an incorrect appraisal of the objective situation to claim that Trump is acting with anything resembling a popular mandate. The more he deepens his plots, the more hated he becomes. There is a critical issue that the popular anger at Trump finds no expression from the political establishment or any institutions. The Democratic Party, far from being an opposition party, has openly collaborated in passing Trump's legislation, funding his government, and in installing his cabinet nominees. Nor have the unions mobilized workers even in defense of their own members. The IYSSE and committees of educators in the United States have taken up the defense of those impacted by the attacks of the Trump government. These defense campaigns have become a major initiative. We utilize it as a lever for the development of class consciousness in growing layers of youth, students, and workers in education, and indeed many industries, fighting to connect to the struggle for democratic rights of students and educators with the social rights of the working class, underscoring that only through the fight, the only way to defend democratic rights under conditions where the ruling class is abandoning and declaring war on its now distant democratic heritage, the only way that the fight to defend democratic rights can be waged is through a deep turn into the working class and to fight for socialism. Thank you, comrades, and there will be subsequent speakers elaborating on the strategy, which I've only begun to raise.
Thank you, David, for those really important remarks. And our second speaker is Zach Diotte. He is president of the IYSSE at Western Sydney University, and we welcome him to the podium.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, David, and good afternoon to all those in attendance. University staff and students across Australia face a historic attack on jobs, conditions, and courses spearheaded by the Albanese Labor government and enforced by the trade unions. At Western Sydney University alone, nearly 200 positions are being axed as part of the transformation of universities into profit-driven institutions, producing job-ready graduates for big business. The same process is binding higher education ever more closely to the preparations for war with universities serving as hubs for weapons research, military partnerships, and pro-imperialist propaganda. These processes directly threaten not only the education but the very future of young people. This is why the IYSSC supports the formation of joint rank and file committees, uniting workers and youth to wage a real struggle. Staff conditions directly shape the quality of student learning. Lecturers and tutors with job insecurity, heavy workloads and stagnant wages have less time and energy to support students, develop comprehensive lessons or provide feedback. Cuts to pay and resources for staff mean larger classes, fewer course options and declining academic standards. Increased casualisation, with many staff now employed on short-term contracts, alongside the emphasis on quick degrees, is turning education into a production line. Universities are systematically cutting down or eliminating entire courses across all areas, particularly arts and humanities, to limit education to only what is deemed necessary for immediate employment. At Macquarie University, for example, bachelor's degrees in archaeology, music, education, and ancient languages will be eliminated, while sociology, ancient history, politics, gender studies, criminology, and psychological studies will be cut back. This has been a decades-long process driven by government policies not just in Australia but globally, and the market forces of capitalism at the same scale. The motivations are twofold: shore up the profits of big business and undermine students' critical thinking. Labor's agenda features sharp cuts to international student enrolments, on which the chronically underfunded universities have relied for fee revenue. International students are charged up to $10,000 up front for a single semester. Stories of international students sleeping in cars or overcrowded share houses to cut expenses are not uncommon. Most work a job, if not two or more, to make ends meet, all while having their work hours restricted by anti-democratic visa requirements. Their study options are entirely limited to what the government deems suitable for gaining permanent residency. Many come from economically and socially oppressed countries in Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East. They are the most vulnerable and exploited student cohort, whose conditions are a precursor for all. Through mandatory practical work or placements, students must labour for minimum wage or nothing for extended periods. During this time, many must take leave from their regular jobs, become casuals or quit entirely, resulting in major income loss. Students doing practicals regularly work long hours with forced overtime and perform multiple tasks beyond the scope of what they're supposed to be learning to cover for their employers' needs. The Labor government is also promoting foul nationalism, seeking to blame international students for the continuing housing affordability and cost of living crisis, while the wealth of property developers and billionaires soar. As Canberra prepares for a catastrophic US-led war against China, the government portrays international students, the majority of which are Chinese, as the enemy. The attack on immigrants is being led by the Trump regime in the US through daily illegal arrests and forced deportations, but the Australian ruling class is no less ruthless about defending its interests. It seeks to follow suit, having in the last months alone reopened the Nauru detention centre, detained a 62-year-old Palestinian refugee as, quote, directly or indirectly a risk to security without providing evidence, and arrested a Chinese permanent resident on charges of, quote, unquote, foreign interference through laws forbidding any public scrutiny. Australian imperialism requires the suppression of free discussion and student life in general. This has been particularly stark in the repression of protests against the Gaza genocide. Across the country, student encampments were shut down by force and threats. In October last year, 2 students peacefully protesting at WSU were violently arrested by police called in by management. At the University of Melbourne, 2 students were expelled and another 2 suspended for their involvement in pro-Palestinian protests, One of the expelled students had attended a protest for no more than 10 minutes. Academics' democratic rights are under the same attacks. Key to the struggles of staff and students is their understanding of a socialist perspective, which groups we describe as pseudo-left actively attempt to block. Pseudo-left groups collaborated in the union-imposed cuts and subsequent cover-up, even handing out NTEU leaflets at WSU. In June, the NTEU called a rally against 300 to 400 job cuts at WSU. In an Instagram post, WSU Socialist Alternatives Campus Group promoted the rally, writing, "Staff cuts happen when universities run like businesses. This is a choice from the six-figure salary executives. The Vice-Chancellor, George Williams, is on a $800,000 salary. That's more than the Prime Minister. We heard today that WSU's 2024 budget reveals that WSU has $800 million in cash and investments. So the money's there. It needs to go back into education instead." Even though cuts were being made across the country, including at Macquarie University, where socialist alternative campaigns as Macquarie Socialists, they promoted the lie that cuts stem from the WSU management's choices. No mention was made in their posts, subsequent publications, or in Socialist Alternatives' red flag press of the NTU's suppression of attempts by longtime academic and union member Mike Head and myself to speak at the rally, culminating in a union representative physically blocking us. Not one pseudo-left group present opposed this. And this was by no means an aberration. In August, a series of special general meetings, SGMs, were held as part of the national referendum on Palestine. At every SGM, run mostly by Socialist Alternative, the same feckless appeals towards genocide-complicit university management and the Labor government were promoted. On behalf of the IYSC at WSU, I intervened in the August SGM, explaining SGMs, petitions, and other pressure tactics using this perspective have been tried for the past 2 years and failed. It's time that we draw some conclusions. Labor supports the genocide because it is a party of imperialist war. That's not going to change with yet another polite request. This is a dead end. We say the working class can and must stop the genocide, not by appealing to the Labor government or university managements, but by fighting against them. Workers can cripple the Zionist war machine through strikes and industrial action, but that means opposing the pro-Labor union leaderships which have blocked such a struggle for 2 years, refusing to call a single strike. The response of the pseudo-left was to ensure the IYSC or anybody else was not allowed to speak at any subsequent SGMs out of fear of being politically exposed. In Solidarity's press this month, an article was published titled "End to Forced Redundancies at ANU Shows Power of Fighting Campaign." The group claimed a, quote, "huge victory had been achieved at ANU through the NTU's campaign for the resignation of the Vice-Chancellor and, quote, the end to forced redundancies." They asserted around 179 staff have accepted voluntary redundancies, but over 100 staff slated for forced redundancy will now keep their jobs. But ANU's replacement interim Vice-Chancellor stated that management had already achieved its job-cutting target, making further forced retrenchments unnecessary. Nearly 1,100 staff have been forced out since last year. This is a rout consciously dressed up as victory. Only 3 days ago, NTU representatives worked with campus security to bar IYSC members from campaigning at an open-air union rally at the University of Newcastle. Our crime was distributing leaflets on the crisis of Australian universities and today's meeting, while the union sought to isolate workers on behalf of management. Behind pseudo-left's appeals to practicality and their efforts to subordinate opposition to the union bureaucracy lies a rejection of the revolutionary role of the working class and a defence of the capitalist system itself. The pseudo-left want to hide the real struggle workers and youth must take up. The IYSC wants to elevate it. The attack on learning and democratic rights in the name of efficiency and war preparations cannot be fought through the existing apparatus of Labor or the unions. An independent movement must be built, linking academics, staff, students, and the broader working class to defend education and every social right from the relentless assault of profit. The potential for such a movement is enormous, but it must be built brick by brick. If you're not yet a member of the IYCC or the CFPE, I urge you to become one today. If you're a worker where we do not yet have a rank and file, or a student where we do not yet have a club, help us build them. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Our final speaker today is Mike Head. He's a staff member at Western Sydney University, and as I said earlier, he's a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party, writes frequently on the WSWS in matters of both education and politics. So I'd like you to provide a warm welcome for Mike Head.
Thanks, everyone, and welcome to the discussion. Last Monday, just 3 days after an estimated 7 million people took to the streets of the United States in the No Kings demonstrations against the fascistic Trump administration's drive towards dictatorship, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese lauded Donald Trump at a White House meeting. This event itself points to the connections between the Labor government's restructuring of Australian universities, accompanied by the destruction of some 4,000 jobs, and the dictatorial and militarist agenda that the Trump regime is spearheading internationally. It also shows the international character of the struggle against this agenda of the corporate ruling class and the need to build new organisations to fight it through the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees, or IWA-RFC, as I'll seek to explain. Across the United States, protesters denounced the destruction of democratic rights, the assault on immigrants, the deployment of troops to cities, the mass firings of federal workers, and the dismantling of social programs. They also opposed the genocide in Gaza, the enrichment of the oligarchy amid mass poverty, and the accelerating drive toward dictatorship and war. Trump, true to his Nazi upbringing, shared on his social media account a video showing the aspiring Führer wearing a crown and piloting a plane emblazoned with the words King Trump, dumping feces over protesters. But at the White House, Albanese not only hailed and solidarised himself with Trump, he declared that the Labor government was taking the 70-year post-World War II alliance with US imperialism to, quote, the next level by signing a critical minerals agreement that is clearly directed against China in preparation for war. Inside the White House cabinet room, Trump and Albanese went out of their way to praise each other. Albanese congratulated Trump on his so-called Middle East peace deal, telling him it was, quote, an extraordinary achievement. That backing came as the renewed Israeli bombings and killings in Gaza continued the genocide and further exposed the neo-colonial character of the White House plan to impose an occupation on the Palestinian population. Behind the mutual lauding of one another in public, the meeting signalled accelerating plans to further transform Australia into a platform for a US-led war against China, including the supply of critical mineral-related raw earths, the processing of many of which China currently dominates globally. Trump described Albanese, quote, as highly respected and doing a fantastic job. In front of cameras, Trump told him, quote, we've been long-time allies, and I would say there's never been anybody better. We fought wars together and we never had any doubts. It's a great honour to have you as my friend and a great honour to have you in the United States of America. Under Albanese, as the White House meeting underscores, Labor has further aligned itself unequivocally with US imperialism and indeed with the dictatorial Trump regime. Other governments too are rapidly militarising, and this has huge implications for education at every level, from primary school to the tertiary institutions. The Japanese parliament last week installed a far-right new Prime Minister, Sanai Takachi, who is committed to remilitarising. In Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz vowed last week to build the strongest army in Europe. In the UK, more than 10,000 university jobs are being eliminated under Keir Starmer's Labor government, which is at the forefront of a military build-up against Russia, as well as the AUKUS treaty against China. We have warned from the outset about this agenda, which lies at the heart of the Albanese government's Universities Accord report, issued in February last year. The Accord report is the blueprint for the pro-corporate and pro-AUKUS restructuring now taking place in one form or another throughout Australia's 39 public universities. That report, whose authors included the Macquarie Bank CEO, Shimara Wikramanayake, Australia's highest paid corporate executive, insisted that universities must focus both their teaching and research on meeting the needs of business and the AUKUS military plan. The Accord report nominated, quote, areas of national priority like clean energy, critical technology, minerals and defence. These fields are all connected to the geostrategic interests of Australian imperialism and its commitment to US war plans. This offensive is accelerating. That was highlighted by a recent speech by ex-Labor and union leader Bill Shorten. Shorten, now a university vice-chancellor, called for the, quote, fundamental reimagining of universities as a, quote, core instrument of our national power under conditions of global instability and war. Shorten proposed replacing many university degrees with a, quote, modular system of mini qualifications to, quote, produce the thousands of nuclear engineers, cyber specialists and AI technicians that the AUKUS enterprise demands at a pace that matches the urgency of our strategic environment. The AUKUS military pact, which involves spending hundreds of billions of dollars to acquire US and UK nuclear-powered attack submarines, long-range missiles and other high-tech weaponry designed for use against China, is part of the Labor government's plans for an all-of-nation war economy, with universities on the front line. The Albanese government is applying intensive financial pressure on the universities to restructure along these lines, including by slashing enrolments by international students, making them scapegoats for the housing affordability crisis. Labor is also maintaining the previous Liberal national government's, quote, job-ready graduate scheme, which hiked the cost of 3 humanities degrees to more than $50,000 while cutting the funding of universities for delivering them. As part of the Universities Accord, as of next January the 1st, university funding will be tied to, quote, mission-based compacts with the Labor government's new Australian Tertiary Education Commission. There is a remarkable similarity between this language of compact and national priorities and the dictates issued to American universities by the Trump regime. As David reported earlier, the White House this month sent a letter to universities entitled, quote, the Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education, demanding that they advance the national interests and priorities of the US government or be defunded. As David also reported, there is intense opposition to this among educators and students. This is the Trump administration's latest assault on the entire education system, but it has a particularly sinister content. It is an American version of the Nazi policy of Gleichschaltung, that is, the integration of culture and education into the arms of the state as a propaganda tool. Some of the Trump regime's demands include prohibiting faculty from speaking about political and social issues, cutting fees for students in, quote, hard science programs that serve military purposes, and reducing the proportion of international students to less than 15%. The echoes between these demands and those of the Albanese government are unmistakable. As in the US, academics and students in Australia who oppose the Gaza genocide have been victimised and persecuted. That includes Randa Abdel Fattah, the Macquarie University scholar whose ARC grant, Australian Research Council grant, remains suspended after the direct intervention of Education Minister Jason Clare. That is despite our fight for a unified national campaign for her defence, which the unions have opposed. In fact, far from opposing the underlying political agenda, the two main campus trade union apparatuses, the National Tertiary Education Union and the Community and Public Sector Union, are assisting the government and the managements to impose it. The union machines have opposed any unified action by university staff and students against this offensive. Instead, they are isolating protests and struggles at individual universities and trying to blame mismanagement by vice-chancellors for the devastating job cuts in order to deflect attention away from the Labor government. At the same time, the unions are working closely with the same managements to stifle resistance. Nationally, the NTU is fraudulently claiming victories at Western Sydney University and the Australian National University. But hundreds of jobs are being eliminated at both, including by so-called voluntary redundancies and spill and fill processes that force workers to compete against one another for fewer jobs as a result of the restructuring. At Thursday's strike rally at the University of Newcastle, where, as Zach reported, the union effectively worked with management to block the campaign of the IYSSE club, the branch president of the NTU, Terry Summers, made clear that the union accepts the management's so-called business improvement program, which is a corporate restructuring plan. And I quote what he said, "We are not saying that the university can't change the way it operates. No one is trying to do that. All we are saying is be reasonable. If you're going to get rid of people, try to be fair." That is a classic statement of the industrial policing role of the trade unions. In other words, the union's role, as elsewhere around the country, is to partner with management in negotiating job cuts and imposing restructuring, including by driving people out via so-called voluntary redundancies in order to suffocate resistance, not to fight the cuts. This shows the need for rank and file committees to unite workers and staff against this offensive. We are saying that we do want to change the way universities operate. We oppose the entire restructuring. By contrast, the NTU National President, Alison Barnes, sent an email to all NTU members this week saying she was, quote, excited to share some historic news. Amid the biggest assault on university jobs since the start of the COVID pandemic, when the NTU played a similar treacherous role in assisting job destruction, Barnes insisted that the same Labor government presiding over this disaster, had now promised to deliver what she called real university governance reform. Barnes's historic news was based on a media release by Education Minister Clare, in which she said the Albanese government would adopt a new set of university governance principles recommended by its own expert council on university governance. These principles are in fact designed to facilitate the university restructuring demanded by Labor's University Accord. The expert council, which included former ACTU President Sharon Barrow, began its report by citing the Accord and, quote, the sharp focus on the need to lift productivity and innovation in Australia. Now, in desperate bids to cover their tracks, the NTU and the CPSU are denouncing the university managements for employing corporate consultants and accusing them of overstating their financial crises. But the union officials are collaborating with the very same managements to implement the restructuring. The reality is that the unions are helping push people out the door, either via voluntary redundancies or sham so-called consultation processes in union enterprise bargaining agreements, or EBAs, with managements that offer little or no protection against retrenchments. At the university where I work, Western Sydney University, anger and frustration erupted for the second time at a recent NTU meeting. Almost 200 jobs are being eliminated at WSU, and about 500 further staff members in, quote, disestablished positions are being forced to compete against each other for new jobs that the management considers, quote, suitable for them. This is the result of a deal struck with the university management by the NTU and the CPSU to assist the management by allowing its Western Sydney reset restructuring to go ahead. On October the 2nd, WSU Vice-Chancellor and President George Williams sent an all-staff email thanking both unions for their, quote, goodwill and constructive engagement in ending a dispute over the restructuring. Quote, this means that our change process will now proceed and is back on track, he wrote. As a result, about a quarter of the university staff members are either being retrenched or displaced, and serious damage is being done to the education quality, course options and futures of students, as Zach explained. At last week's NTU members meeting at WSU, David Birchall, the NTU's branch president, admitted that displaced staff members were being told by their managers to apply for multiple jobs, up to 5 or 10 each. Participants in the meeting spoke of being freaked out by the demand. Now, as Zach explained, at WSU, like everywhere else, the union bureaucracies are being supported by the shooter-left groups that falsely portray themselves as socialists, such as Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance, Solidarity, and their front groups like WSU Socialists. They even hand out the NTU's leaflets justifying its actions. All the shooter-left groups insist that workers and students must not break out of the trade union straitjacket, and they are just as silent as the unions themselves on the underlying agenda of the Labor government. As Zach explained, they reject entirely the revolutionary role of the working class. In fact, they are the last line of defence of the labour and union machines, and through them, the capitalist political and economic order itself. Political conclusions must be drawn from these experiences. The record of the NTU and CPSU is no aberration. It flows from the transformation of the unions internationally, from defensive organisations of the working class, always within the framework of wage labour, into industrial policing agencies. In Australia, this has taken the form of the anti-strike enterprise bargaining system, first imposed by the ACTU and the Hawke-Keating Labor governments in the 1980s and 1990s. There is no prospect of steering or pressuring the union apparatuses away from this course. They are thoroughly integrated into the corporate and political establishment at every level, from the EBAs to the joint union management superannuation funds that are now among the largest sources of investment for the Australian capitalist class. That is why we must form rank and file committees as the new forms of organisation of the working class. Democratically elected committees of university workers and students can elaborate and fight for demands based on their interests and those of high quality education, not the dictates of the corporate elites and their parliamentary and trade union servants. Through the International Workers Alliance of Rank and File Committees, IWA RFC, they can link up with educators' rank and file committees in the US and elsewhere, and with workers in every industry worldwide. This fight can be won only on an international scale. Through the IWA RFC, rank and file committees can lay the foundations for overturning capitalism itself and establishing genuine democratic and socialist workers' governments. Increasingly clearly, that is the only alternative to the plunge of capitalism worldwide into fascistic forms of rule and another catastrophic world war. That is why we urge everyone taking part in this meeting to help us build rank and file committees throughout the education system and the working class as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for that important report. Look, we've had three very important and very insightful reports. I'm sure that there are questions. And so what I want to do now is open up for questions and discussion. Sir, we have somebody in the room who's going to be speaking.
The restructuring of universities in Australia and in America, well, really across the Western sphere, does it represent a need for socialist organizations to, well, get serious about organizing in the face of crisis across the globe? Climate change, social inequality, and the gearing up for war with China and Russia. Do we need to get more involved with universities and workplaces that have been subsumed by corporatized unions?
Well, other people might want to speak, but absolutely, yes. That's entirely what we're fighting for. But let me just make this point. Organising a fight requires also political clarity. Who are we fighting against? And who is with us and who is against us in that sense? As I said before, and as Zach outlined, there are various groups around who call themselves socialists, but are what we designate as pseudo-left. And their role is actually to push and fight in the other direction. While they may pay lip service to socialism as some far-off, distant objective, and even talk about Marxism occasionally, their whole perspective is that the working class is not capable of overturning capitalism. And therefore you must not fight for that perspective. You have to adhere to, confine the struggle to the current political and union establishment in one form or another. That's why, as we said, they even hand out leaflets on behalf of the union at the campuses. Now, our position is entirely opposite. We turn out to the working class. We turn out to the factories. We turn out to the working class neighbourhoods. We urge students to join us in that mobilisation. At the same time, we fight to clarify, and that's the most essential question. What exactly is at stake? I mean, as you say, this is a truly historic crisis of capitalism and therefore of humanity that we now confront. Universities, of course, have been restructured for decades in a pro-corporate direction. Let's not paint a picture that universities are currently in some, perfect form. Far from it. They've been subjected to such pressures for a long, long time. In fact, particularly since the Hawke and Keating governments in Australia and paralleling worldwide. But this is now an entirely qualitative further turn. You know, we're not exaggerating when we compare what Trump is doing in America to what the Nazis did to the universities in Germany in the 1930s. They have to become nothing more than propaganda outlets and training schools for the military. So we are seeking to bring to public consciousness and the consciousness of educators and students at every level. And this is not just the universities. And I think we can discuss this more today. This obviously has to seep down, or not just seep down, it's brought down into the schools themselves. Within the schools, we have similar processes underway, AUKUS apprenticeships and similar schemes to increasingly inculcate in young people the necessity to turn in this direction. Now, the greatest danger in this situation is to underestimate what's at stake here and to underestimate the role of the labour and union bureaucracy. And historically, this has been their role. In both world wars, it was Labor governments who were brought to office to carry out the war agenda. And they were backed to the hilt by the trade unions at the time, despite tremendous opposition in the working class against conscription, against the sacrifices that were demanded. And in World War II, those struggles were led in an important way by our movement, the Trotskyist movement at the time. But today we have a lot more at stake even than in those two conflagrations. Capitalism is now hell-bent on another course of war, this time with nuclear weapons, almost certainly. And we've got to, seek to develop an understanding in the working class and among young people of what is at stake here. That's what we're seeking to hold with these meetings. As David said, speaking from the US, we'll be holding further meetings. We're continually fighting to develop an understanding in the working class of what is at stake and who we have to break out of the grip of in order to bring forward give conscious expression to the enormous opposition which does exist in America and internationally to the program of the Voices. As we speak, we've got strikes and struggles breaking out all over Europe and in New Zealand, as well as in the United States. Any conception that Australia is an exception to this would be very wrong as well. There's huge struggles coming up, but the critical issue is perspective, understanding, program, and organisation. We've got to build new forms of organisation that can lead this kind of fight. That's what we're fighting to do at this meeting and in all of our work.
Thank you. I'm just going to read out some of the comments online as well. Of course, we can have more discussion and questions. So this was just, I think, the two comments in response really to the role of the unions. Kiri said, secondary teachers have suffered unfair dismissal through the guise of teacher improvement programs. The New South Wales Teachers Federation have been pivotal in ridding the Department of Education of qualified teachers. And then we also have a comment from Amin who said, often said organisers may make their objective to seek compromises and rest on the laurels of past, limited compromises that are rapidly evaporating. We also have a question from online, and I think maybe Sue might be putting up her hand to answer the question. So the question is, how can we begin to establish these new committees? This is a question from Syed. How can we begin to establish these new committees? And I think Sue is going to answer that question online.
Thanks for the questions, and thank you very much for the speeches from the three comrades, which have outlined very clearly the sort of analysis of what is taking place in public education and the universities, but also the agenda and program that has to be fought for. And during the course, I just want to speak particularly on what's happening in secondary and primary schools. as they are a part of this process too. And in the course of answering that, I want to deal with some of the questions that have come up and comments. I mean, the process that comrades have described is also very much underway and accelerating in Australia's primary and secondary schools. Decade after decade, public schools have faced deepening financial cuts imposed by successive state and federal Labor and coalition governments, enforced through ever-worsening enterprise agreements by the teacher unions. As other speakers have emphasised, the unions are utterly complicit in these processes and directly responsible, acting to straitjacket the growing educator opposition. And the comment from Kiri is correct. Teachers are and have been unfairly sacked, and this has been agreed to and developed, designed by the teacher unions, not just the New South Wales Teachers Federation, but all the teacher unions. The result of this gutting process has created a chronically under-resourced public school system, short of staff and basic facilities, while billions are being funneled into the elite private schools boasting swimming pools, sporting centres, theatres, science laboratories and lavish amenities, creating one of the most privatised and unequal education systems in the world. Conditions in public schools are appalling. We face crushing workloads, often exceeding 60 hours a week, while thousands leave the profession each year. Classrooms are overcrowded, violence and frustration are rising, and students with complex needs are left without any support. Researchers emphasise that teachers are not overwhelmed by teaching itself, but by the endless admin and compliance tasks imposed by government accountability regimes. These pressures are driving an exodus from the profession. Only 1 in 3 teachers intend to remain until retirement. Surveys show workload, inadequate pay, and student behaviour are the main reasons. Against the myth that it's all tremendous in Australia, land of, great conditions and so on, according to the OECD, and this is a recent report, Australian teachers are the second most stressed in the developed world, with widespread burnout and growing secondary trauma. For example, in the state of Victoria, the government has secretly slashed more than $2.4 billion in promised school funding, and teachers in Victoria already face the lowest paid nationally. Now, at the same time, the Albanese Labor government is transforming education from universities down to primary schools under the banner of what we call national priorities. In practice, this means subordinating the entire education system to the demands of big business and the military, preparing the population for a war economy under the AUKUS Pact against China. Now, much of this militarisation is entering schools, both secondary and primary schools, by stealth, through programs such as the 5.2 million Schools Pathway program. The government partners directly with weapons manufacturers, including Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems and Saab, as well as the Defence Science and Technology Group. These corporations fund projects, supply curriculum materials, sponsor school competitions, and promote what they call career pathways in weapons manufacturing and defence research, targeting lower socio-economic public schools in regional areas devastated by underfunding. These communities, including teachers, are desperate for resources and are being subjected to what we can call economic conscription. By embedding military-linked content in STEM subjects, cadet programs and what they call career inspiration schemes, governments are normalising the notion that serving the defence industry is patriotic, prestigious, an exciting job for the future. Now, this is turning public schools into something else. It's turning them into a recruitment arm for the war machine and narrowing the curriculum to stifle critical thought. This process, as Zach has explained, is going on in the universities too. The once progressive agenda of developing an educated, all-rounded child, a curious, critical, creative thinker, is being eliminated through cuts, data-driven programs, including the imposition of the retrogressive teaching methods of direct instruction. What is needed by the ruling elite in conditions of war is a compliant workforce of young people who will not question authority, is obedient, patriotic, and is prepared to commit to war and sacrifice for the nation. This, however, is clearly an immense problem for the ruling elite, with growing anti-war sentiment among students, educators, and the working class as a whole. Now, what all the speakers have stressed is that what is urgently required now is new organisations of struggle, fighting for an anti-capitalist program and an organisation and the means to fight back. Now, one of the questions that Saad asked is, well, how do we do this? What's the first step? I mean, what we're fighting for is independent rank and file committees. As elaborated here, we've been discussing fighting for these on the universities. Committees of students and university workers, academics, and so on. But these sort of organisations have to be developed in the schools, in the high schools, and right throughout the working class. These are democratic organisations of discussion and action are needed. And of course, as Mike elaborated, a network of committees has to be established in the working class, nationally and internationally. And of course, that's the purpose of the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees. On the question of students, this is an important issue. And what the IYSSC and David's elaborated is that students by themselves can't resolve the problems that are being confronted, the immense and complex problems that are being confronted in society. Students, the IYSE, have to turn out to the working class. They have to turn out to factories, workplaces, and encourage the development in these workplaces of rank and file organisations, independent of the union. I mean, the unions, as been discussed, are the means by which workers are being straitjacketed and every attack is being imposed. So the first step, is join the IYSSC, join the Committee for Public Education, become involved in a rank and file committee at the universities, but be a part particularly of turning out to the working class, because that's where the real power is. It's the working class that are going to change society, and they require a program, which is what we're fighting for and elaborating.
Thank you, Sue. I should have said Sue's a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party here in Australia. She's the national convener of the Committee for Public Education, and she also writes on education and other things regularly on the World Socialist website, and is a primary school teacher in Victoria. Earlier on, both Mike and I think, mentioned that just recently in New Zealand, there was a strike of public sector workers, something like 60,000 teachers, I believe, more than 110,000 people, 3.5% of the population. We actually have with us online Tom, and Tom is the leader of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, which is aligned with the International Committee of the Fourth International. He's a regular writer for the World Socialist website, and he's going to speak to us online now. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I'm very happy to be here and on behalf of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. And I'll just say a few words about what's taken place here. The New Zealand mass strike by perhaps 110,000 public sector workers, mostly teachers and healthcare workers, has been a really major experience, not just for this country and for working people here, but really for Australia as well, and this entire region of the world, I think. I mean, it is a historic strike, the largest in New Zealand in more than 40 years. And I would say it's only in anticipation of even greater and more bitter eruptions of the class struggle as the social crisis deepens, and, you know, as we are already seeing in the United States and across Europe and other parts of the world. We intervened as the Socialist Equality Group in the Auckland demonstration, which had about 15,000 people in it on Thursday, and spoke with some of the workers there who are intensely angry at the outraged over the state of decay of the health system and public education. And they told us about the extraordinary pressures on teachers, not only from understaffed schools, for example, but the broader social crisis, the number of children and young people living in poverty, which is about 1 in 5, for example, which places enormous pressures on teachers. And the current, I mean, the main issue that triggered this combined strike by all these workers is the National Party-led government seeking to drive down their wages by offering just 2% a year, or less in some cases, to each of these different groups of workers, doctors, nurses, teachers, and other healthcare workers as well. And 2%, of course, is far below the rate of inflation. And in some cases, this would be 2% a year for 3 years. So 3 years of pay cuts. And it's also much below the cost of living for basic items, food, etc. So, I mean, what the government is doing is claiming that it has no money for any of these services, while it, at the same time, diverts billions and billions of dollars to the military budget, which is being doubled, as in Europe, as in the United States, Australia, etc. The same is happening here. So there is, as I say, a developing anger and militancy about this over these attacks. But the Socialist Equality Group and the World Socialist website have warned in our statements on the strike that this cannot remain subordinated to the union bureaucracy, which has a very definite perspective in this dispute, or these disputes, of splitting them all up into different sections of workers, isolating them from each other, and accepting and imposing sellout agreements that will do nothing to improve wages and nothing to resolve the catastrophic situation in hospitals, the staffing crisis in schools. They were forced to call this strike against their will by the mass anger among their members. It was an exercise in letting off steam as far as the unions are concerned. They have no further such strikes planned. The aim is to shut this movement down as soon as they can, and to tell workers to place their faith in maybe electing a Labour-led government in about 12 months' time. Well, they only need to look at Australia and the Labour government there to see what that would be like. I mean, as we explained when we intervened here in the strike, the austerity measures that have resulted in these conditions didn't just begin with the current right-wing coalition government, but were well underway during the right-wing Labour Party coalition government led by Jacinda Ardern, which also included the Green Party and the right-wing New Zealand First Party for some of its time in office was part of it as well. That government, Labour, lost power in the 2023 election 2 years ago in a landslide defeat because its policies had produced soaring homelessness, inequality, child poverty was going up, and it had done nothing about the historic running down of hospitals and schools, and there had been numerous strikes under the Ardern government by nurses and teachers as well. So, I mean, as is the case in Australia, the Labour Party in New Zealand really has no differences from the right-wing National Party government. It also agrees with the alliance with the United States and the build-up to war against China, which is increasingly imminent, notwithstanding the sort of mealy-mouthed calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. The Labour Party here also supported Israel's genocidal attack on the Gaza Strip when it was still the government. And these should have been critical issues in the strike by public sector workers, as we said in our statement, because it's the working class that is paying the price for war through austerity and through the attacks on its wages. And yet the issue of war and military spending is totally, completely buried by the union bureaucracy because they agree, just like Labour, with these policies. Even after the Defence Minister, Judith Collins, attacked the strike on the eve of the strike, said that the teachers' union was too focused on supposedly being pro-Palestine, the response of the unions to her sort of unhinged attack was to say that Palestine had nothing to do with the strike, and in fact, the secondary teachers' union, the PPTA, told its members that they should not raise political issues on their placards during the rallies, including the issue of Palestine. So they are seeking to totally divorce the struggles of the working class over wages and conditions from everything else, from the fight against attacks on democratic rights, from the fight against imperialist war and fascism. And it's only our movement that insists that these struggles are inextricably connected, as the other speakers have explained very well in this meeting. And I think this meeting today has also drawn out the international character of the assault by the oligarchy in every country on jobs and public services. If the working class is going to defeat these attacks, it has to have its own international strategy. It has to link up its struggles across borders, including the unification of workers in Australia with workers in New Zealand through the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees. That, again, is something that the union bureaucracy is extremely hostile towards. It seeks to divide up workers not only based on industry and job type, but by whipping up anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalism of every kind. The the point I want to stress is about the recent strike here is that the working class needs a socialist perspective to fight. It is not lacking in anger. It's not lacking in willingness to fight. But it is a fact that neither the unions nor any of the capitalist political parties at Thursday's rally, for instance, the Labour Party, the Greens, and their supporters in the pseudo-left organisations, none of them put forward any perspective for the working class. I mean, literally, they had nothing to say at this protest. They left the speeches to the union bureaucrats who made no concrete demands. They just, spouted empty phrases about the necessity to invest in public services. It was only the Socialist Equality Group, our movement, which distributed a political statement explaining the way forward and spoke to workers about that. And that includes building rank and file committees, which comrades have talked about today, that genuinely represent workers and are controlled by workers and not subordinate to the pro-capitalist unions which are preparing a sellout. We proposed that such committees should completely reject this backroom attempt to force a wage freeze against inflation and reject all the claims that there's no money for decent wages. We called for an immediate pay increase of 30% for all the workers in the strike, and for the strike, for the movement of the working class to be broadened to every industry, and above all, for a new party, a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International to be built in New Zealand to fight to mobilise for around socialist demands for the investment of billions and billions of dollars in schools, hospitals, and other services, which would be paid for by expropriating the rich and putting an end to all military spending. So I mean that's a program for that we will be discussing in another upcoming webinar, which I encourage everyone here to attend, which the Socialist Equality Group will be hosting on November the 9th at 4 p.m. New Zealand time, which will probably be 2 p.m. in Melbourne. We strongly encourage everyone in this meeting to attend and take part in that discussion as well. So thank you for the opportunity to speak at this important meeting.
Thank you very much. So, look, we had a couple of comments come through online. Merrin says, I've just bailed from primary school after 35 years, sick of the lack of support. And then Sue, of course, spoke also on the influence of the military in schools. And Saad said, absolutely true. Some of my friends from school, so many of my friends from public school wanted to join the army for a funded degree, as the degrees through traditional means are too expensive to pay for. So thank you for those comments. Now, we've had a couple of additional questions directed for David specifically, who's still joining us online. Can David outline the treacherous role of teachers' union leader Randy Weingarten, who's one of the union leaders of the teachers' union in the United States? So that's a question from Margaret. And then there's a question from Frank. Hi, David. Can you outline the impact of the ICE raids taking place in the schools and the response of students and teachers? So, David, are you happy to answer those questions? Can I hand over to you?
Yes. Thank you for the questions. And I just saw in the chat another question was posted. Is there a change in the consciousness of the American working class in terms of breaking free from the two-party, quote-unquote, democratic system and the assault against the working class and the role of the International Committee of the Fourth International in this? So to take up the first question on the role of Randy Weingarten. Weingarten, for many years, up until recently, in fact, was actually a member of one of some of the highest committees in the leadership of the Capitalist Democratic Party. And in that capacity has served very directly the role of American militarism, such as visiting Ukraine in 2014 following the putsch, which implemented the pro-US government. Weingarten's presence on a picket line means that maneuvers are being made at the highest levels of the unions to shut down any strike that is ongoing without meeting any of the demands of the workers striking. This was the case only a few years ago in Chicago when the teachers were striking against the unsafe reopening of schools under circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just recently, Weingarten put out a book titled Why Fascists Fear Teachers. And the entire argument, the thesis of the book was that because fascists fear an educated populace, that under no circumstances should any labor actions be undertaken by teachers, that no strikes should be organized, that no that teachers essentially should never strike against a fascist government, and that teachers need to stay at work, which this twisted logic really is a post hoc rationalization for the policy which Union President Weingarten has unyieldingly defended of preventing strikes from teachers and doing everything in her capacity as a union president from preventing any strikes from being carried out. And this connects very closely with the second question. The ICE raids taking place in and around schools is very traumatizing to students, to parents, and to teachers. Indeed, there are schools in various parts of the country where chronic, the term used by the capitalist class and media is chronic absenteeism. Well, what this really means is that students are staying home and parents are not taking their children to school for fear of being picked up, regardless of citizenship status, regardless of whether or not the immigrant parents are here with or without papers. There is an immense amount of fear in many communities. And this is having an effect on schools. There are schools where ICE raids have taken place, where students and parents of students have been picked up by ICE. And the other teachers at the school are outraged that the union is doing nothing whatsoever against these attacks and raids. And there is a growing sentiment among not just teachers, but really workers in every industry where ICE raids have been carried out, that the unions are essentially asleep on the job. And there is a growing frustration of the with among workers with the leadership of the unions that many workers, in fact, who are even members of the union, are being taken by ICE, and the union has done absolutely nothing to defend their own membership, which is again it's tied very closely with our call for rank and file committees. That if the leadership of the unions are going to do nothing to defend even their own members, then a new organization and a new leadership needs to be, and the initiative for this needs to come from the working class itself. And our party, our movement has urged workers to take initiative. That workers can't wait. If you have a coworker or a neighbor or a friend who's being taken away by a police force, which we've compared to the Gestapo, there can be no waiting for the signal from the union bureaucracy to organize opposition and prepare strike action. And I suppose these two questions also tie into this third question, which has been raised. Is there a change in the consciousness of the American working class? How could there not be? I mean, when the working class has been made the direct target of attacks by the federal government, that could not but have an immense radicalizing effect. And the total lack of opposition and direct collaboration from the so-called opposition party um, to these attacks being carried out against the population has, in fact, created a serious differentiation between those layers who are oriented to reform and the Democratic Party, and a sizable and growing layer in the population which sees the Democratic Party as a dead end, and that the fighting ground on which our movement and our party is building a working class movement is being objectively established, and it is really up to our movement to fight to win these workers and layers of progressive youth and serious intellectuals to a perspective oriented to the working class. I was the Socialist Equality Party in the United States held a meeting earlier today, in fact, where in every part of the country, comrades reported conversations they had with protesters and workers in their areas in the aftermath of this No Kings protest, where the question of what next, what is to be done, and a sense of a deep distrust of all of the official leaders of the so-called opposition party, including the public-facing left of the party, which is what we would characterize as pseudo-left, Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, and other figures. A deep distrust is growing, and the fight for clarification and the fight for political perspective is the factor which only our party can provide in directing the direction and creating the organization which can lead a revolutionary struggle for socialism in the United States. So I guess to sum up, when you look back throughout the history of social struggle, when the population is directly attacked by the government, which represents an infinitesimally small portion of the population, when the population at large is made the direct target of the attacks that represent the interests of the oligarchs, a very quick break from the old way of thinking takes place, and that is the fertile soil on which the revolutionary socialist program of the Socialist Equality Party can find an eager audience, and we're fighting to give this vast sentiment expression, to transform attitudes into organization and action, and really a systematic fight to raise the class consciousness of the working class in the United States. So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you, David, for that interesting and very insightful response. We really appreciate it. If you are interested in forming a rank and file committee at your work, at joining the CFPE, at joining the IYSSC, then you can. The contact details are on this screen here. We encourage you to join the CFPE or the IYSSC. And if you are interested in joining either the Macquarie University Rank and File Committee or the Western Sydney University Rank and File Committee, then the best way to get in contact with us is through that CFPE email there, cfpe.oz@gmail.com, and the IYSSC has a website there. So we strongly encourage you to make a very important decision to join those rank and file committees. And if what we've said today, what you've heard today, makes sense to you, and if you want to join the fight to educate the working class, to become a member of the Socialist Equality Party, then we urge you to speak to somebody in the room. So thank you very much for your attendance. Really appreciate it.